Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we're sitting down to discuss I Will Never See the World Again by the renowned Turkish writer Ahmet Altan. It's a slight volume but packs a powerful punch. Each of its essays was smuggled out of the prison where Altan serves and continues to serve a life sentence.
A.L. Kennedy said of this brief memoir, "Read this. It will explain why you ever read anything, why anyone ever writes." But what did my book club make of it? Keep listening to find out. Hello, and here we are in the shed. Laura and I are delighted to be joined by Andy, who, regular listeners of our pod, this will be a familiar name to you because very often his comments or book recommendations are mentioned, and now we have the man himself.
Thank you. I'm happy to join you.
Hi, Andy.
It is good to have you here. And so you are the man to ask, because this is another one that you brought to the book club. What made you want to read this book? And to get us to read it, crucially.
I like a mixture of fiction and non-fiction, so I thought time to have some non-fiction. I read a review by Simon Callow in The Guardian, I think. I was shopping and I saw the book and I remembered it. And it's a nice cover and I thought we should try that. There's a lot in the press about Turkey. I've read a lot about Turkey recently and the politics and locking up journalists. It's all very, very topical. I guess it's a way of supporting writers who are locked up for trumped-up charges.
Well, and there's another connection here for Laura and me, because Philippe Sands, who's our total all-time...
Best person in the world.
Yeah, we're such fans. Philippe Sands is a international human rights lawyer. He sounds like a Bridget Jones character, doesn't he? But he's a real person. And he is involved with PEN. Now, what is PEN? It's the organisation that tries to help and protect writers who are...
being persecuted around the world.
And so he, I think, was probably involved in bringing this book to the publishing world and promoting it.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. And he has written the foreword. And as soon as I opened it and saw that Philippe Sands was putting his name in front of Altan's essays, I was like, oh gosh, this will be a good book.
And of course, crucially, he is also representing him in the International Court of Human Rights in his struggle to win his freedom.
Do we have a bit of background on how these essays came out of the prison?
I do have some Altan facts, actually, because there's a very helpful blurb on the back flap of the paperback cover. Born in 1950, Ahmet Altan is one of Turkey's most important writers. In the purge following the failed coup in July 2016, Altan was sent to prison pending trial for giving subliminal messages in support of the coup. In February 2018, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole for attempting to overthrow the government. 51 Nobel laureates have signed an open letter to President Erdogan calling for Altan's release. Altan is the author of 7 essay collections and 10 novels, 2 of which, Endgame and Like a Sword Wound, are available in English. The translator, and we'll have to excuse us for not knowing how to pronounce any of these Turkish names, but Yasemin, it's a C with a cedilla, isn't it? So is that Konjar?
Or Chonwar?
Chonwar.
We apologise. Turkish is a very difficult language.
Sorry, I should have found someone Turkish to ask, which would have been incredibly easy for me to do. But anyway, she is a friend of his, and she writes at the beginning of the book, "The essays in this book reached me one by one over a period of 7 months between November 2017 and May 2018. They arrived among the personal notes Ahmet had given to our lawyers during their visits to him at Silivri prison." So yeah, these precious pages of his writing were smuggled out of the prison. That's kind of weird, isn't it, as well, to think that the guards and the prison authorities had no idea that this book was being written and that then it would be published and it would bring his situation and, I suppose, the plight of many intellectual and cultural figures in Turkey to the attention of the wider world.
But I think I have read he's still writing books in prison. So they have smuggled these out, but I think he is still writing and must have some time and paper.
There's one essay where he talks about his writing habits, and so there is an element of surprise that he is still allowed to write, I suppose. Like, he is allowed to buy a pen and he's allowed to have paper, and we do talk about smuggling. All of the marketing press copy does, but you do wonder how tightly they're supervising him. At the same time, it would be a huge frustration to Erdogan's regime that this book has been published in English for an international readership and is shedding light on these human rights abuses in Turkey.
And there is something quite haunting about it as you read it, in that you know that the very fact that this book exists is not going to help him be released from prison. You know, he's in there for the slightest of trumped-up charges. One of the essays is about his trial, and this is the point where it does become Kafkaesque. Nothing means anything. It's clear that almost like reason and the rule of law have no part in the proceedings, and the judge is totally going to do whatever he wants and whatever whim. But this is someone's life that's at stake here, and indeed he then gets locked up.
And all of these judges are recent appointees that Erdogan has put in place because he's now controlling the courts. And actually the old judges, the judges pre-military coup, are all in prison with Ahmet Altan, as is half of the military leadership from the time before the coup.
We should probably try and just explain to people a little bit more about him. He is a very well-established writer in Turkey. He published many books, and some of them had sold very widely, and he had edited a newspaper, which also was slightly provocative. I think he was known for being against the government regime. And then this all kind of caught up with him in a way. He's an older man. Is he in his 70s? You know, he's not young.
I get the impression he's in his late 60s or 70s.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what. But his brother was locked up at the same time, he mentions, and his father was locked up at some point. I'm not sure whether he mentioned his grandfather, but it seems to be
the family history.
A cyclical thing of generations getting locked up for free speech.
That's one of the things that almost made it so precious in a way, was I had this real sense of this life well lived and this incredibly rich intellectual inner life and this source of knowledge that he sort of carries within him through a lifetime's reading and writing and engaging with the world around him. And so then when he is locked up and he's effectively trapped and has nothing, he finds his way through it because he is able to retreat and to escape into the world of his imagination and his memories. And that for him is his way of staying free.
We talked a bit at the book club. If he had been younger and hadn't had the experience, would he be more bitter? And it'd be a very different book, and maybe not the book we would have wanted to read. So I think that age and that wisdom comes through, and everyone liked his voice and his personality. I think we all really thought, if you're in prison, share a cell with him.
Absolutely.
He's cheerful and optimistic.
Philippe Sands, in his introduction to the book, talks about how he went to visit Altan in prison. He was the first person who'd been allowed him to see him. I think he'd been locked up for 2 years at that point. And Sands writes about how they sat in the room together, they had half an hour, and he said, and they spent most of the time laughing. Altan does seem to be just one of those people who have this capacity for joy, even in the most impossible of circumstances. But I think what really comes through this book is that that's almost a political act, that's a choice on his part. He has to work quite hard at it, but that's what keeps his humanity alive and intact in this sort of terrible situation.
Yeah, he's very defiant, but not in an angry way. His defiance comes through in his humour and his ability to decide that he will react to the situation he's been put in on his own terms. And so when he gets into the police car on the morning he's arrested and the door slams behind him, he almost begins to have a bit of a panic attack because he realises, my goodness, I'm done now. I have no free will. What am I going to do now? And when he gets offered a cigarette from one of the policemen, he says, oh, no, thank you. I only smoke when I'm nervous. And he's like, well, where did this come from? What was I meaning? But just by saying I only smoke when I'm nervous, I completely deflated the policeman's power over me and kind of talked myself into an entirely different state of being. Suddenly I was relaxed. Suddenly I was calm. And he goes up and down. You know, there are really terrible times for him where he does almost succumb to despair. But he figures out coping mechanisms that lead him back to his imagination and his ability to tell stories and to think about his situation in an entirely fresh way.
Can I read a little bit? Each of the essays has a sort of slightly different theme, and this is the one about his sense of a loss of identity. At the end of the corridor of cells, there was an iron door. When you pushed it open, 2 sinks appeared. There was no mirror above them, only the wall. Like everyone else, I'm so used to seeing my own reflection first thing in the morning that I looked straight ahead, expecting to see my face. It had disappeared. In that instance, I felt as if I had crashed into the wall. Like everyone else, I looked around, searching for myself. I wasn't there. It was as if I had been erased from life, tossed away. Looking at that bare wall drove home what it means to see your own reflection. However many thousands of times mirrors appear as a literary metaphor, the reality is more significant than a metaphor could ever be. The mirror shows you to you. It confirms your being. The distance between you and the mirror creates a field that belongs only to you, a field that surrounds you, is yours, somewhere no one else can trespass. I remember when you suggested this book, Andy, and I just thought, oh, it sounds a bit depressing. Why is this book not depressing?
I think he's just very uplifting, and the wisdom and the warmth, very insightful, some beautiful writing. but it is very simply written. The first 10 pages I read on the bus back from the bookshop, and then I've realised it was Philippe Sands, and I thought you would all love it because of him, and that would be my way to get you to read a book I wanted to read, and it worked. But I think it's just his warmth when he's sharing a cell with people with different religions. He's talkative, he's interesting, he draws them out. He's always got this optimism or a way of turning around the negative into something more positive. I think it must help, having had generations of people going through it. Politics do change quite regularly. It must help deep down to know it probably won't be for the rest of his life. Things will change, and maybe 5 or 10 years later, someone else will come along and he'll be out again.
You say that, but because he's as old as he is, I think that even that is in question. You hope that. Certainly when I'm reading it, I'm thinking, surely he'll be released. But at the same time, he hasn't been released yet, and the situation in Turkey is not getting any better, is it? In fact, it's sort of getting worse. For all we've talked about his sort of spirit and his optimism, it's called I Will Never See the World Again. You know, he himself has to accept that that is his reality.
And actually, when he goes to a second trial, or maybe it's his first trial, but basically hope sneaks in. And it's hope that is almost destroying. You can't hope once you're in prison. You have to just live day to day.
I thought also the insight into a writer's mind was kind of amazing to read. You know, he wasn't just anyone that they locked up. They locked up a writer, and how a writer would cope with that. What did you think?
I thought very much of a thinker. I'm not sure about a writer, but definitely the thinker, the way he looked at things, and as you mentioned, the way people took his face away. I think that's something which is one very simple image, which you first need to notice and then put it in writing. But the fact he noticed it, I think it's obviously very observant, seems a very philosophical person.
It's an incredible book for that reason. You say the writing is very simple. And that's almost a problem, because sometimes you can just plow on and realize you haven't taken the time to unpack what is quite a simple sentence, but has a very complex idea behind it.
I've really found that reading it a second time for the pod, just to refresh my memory. And it's that thing, isn't it, about the second time reading, but it does seem so beautiful and so profound, but I feel like I'm sort of sinking into it in a way that I didn't necessarily the first time, because the first time I sort of just wanted to know what happened.
There's a lot more in it. It's quite a slim book. Reading it twice, there's so many sentences and stories, observations you notice again, and they really stick with you for a long time, I think.
Aside from even the philosophical musings, I just found his description of life in prison and his portraits of the different inmates who he shared cells with fascinating.
There's a really beautiful bit where he talks about waking up one night and the moon is shining through the bars of his cell, and in a single line manages to convey so much about that moment and that image, and actually it's too beautiful, and he kind of retreats from it, because going back to the idea of hope, it's the same, the idea of beauty. You know, when you see beauty, that just brings the awfulness of your situation home, and so he just gets up and goes downstairs and flees the moonlight.
We've been saying how optimistic and kind-hearted he is, and he is all those things, but he's also a realist. And he does a very good dissection of evil at one point, where he is talking about a nurse in the hospital when he goes for a checkup. And she is just cruel and unnecessarily terrible. I mean, it's hard to even describe. He doesn't try to justify it or explain it away. He says she is just chosen to be that way. And there are humans who just have no capacity for kindness.
I remember we talked about that in book club, didn't we? Because we were sort of trying to find, like, well, why would she have behaved that way? Maybe there was a reason. Maybe she'd had terrible experiences with other prisoners. It was to do with the handcuffs, wasn't it? Yeah. And he was hoping that he would have his handcuffs removed so that he could be examined. He was quite seriously ill and he'd been sent to this hospital. And the guards were ready to take the handcuffs off. And she said, no, he needs to keep them on. And it meant so much to him that... almost like the tiny gesture of restoring his sense of being a human being, and she sort of denied him that. And it did seem so awful in the book. You're like, oh, why would you do that? Why would anyone do that? Why would anyone be so inhuman? But yeah, in the book club we were sort of like, well, you know, maybe she'd had like a really terrible experience with another prisoner. Maybe she was afraid. But I think we came down on the side that no, she was just a horrible person.
But it was a very simple evil. I guess it was like a very banal, it wasn't what you imagine evil. It's not an evil thing. I think he talks about she probably has a very normal life and a very normal husband and comes to work and she does her job and she has one thing to do in the day where she could have perhaps redeemed herself, and she chose that moment to be evil as one very, very small point. It wasn't, as you imagine, a concentration camp guard, or it's not so many things you imagine be evil. She's doing a very normal person, doing a very normal job, but that one point where she could make a difference, she chose very deliberately not to.
And that's contrasted with earlier in the book. The first time he goes to the hospital, they go to see a doctor, and the purpose for that is so that they can prove on record that the prisoners haven't been tortured, so they have to go and see a doctor in order to have a checkup. And this doctor, when he goes into the room, says to him, "There's a mirror over there, you can go and look," understanding what that means.
And there's another doctor or worker in the hospital who whispers under his breath as he passes, I think it's, "I'm praying for you, Ahmet Altan," or like, "God bless you, Ahmet Altan." And that's actually an indication of just how much Ahmet Altan is a national treasure. I was trying to think, like, who would be the equivalent in the UK? And maybe it would be Philippe Sands. Like, putting Ahmet Altan into prison is as despicable as it would be to put Philippe Sands into prison here. These two individuals are, greatest of what humanity can produce, and you imprison them. You do have that feeling as you read it.
I'm sure Philippe Sands does have some flaws.
No, I'm sure he does. But, there is such wisdom in their words, and they are leading a conversation. Other individuals do great acts of kindness on a smaller scale. And I think that's actually where Ahmet Altan's coming from, is that some people are brave enough to be kind in these moments of adversity when they're on other sides of the divide.
Talking of evil, I didn't find the doctor to us as bad as the judges, who had all this responsibility and power and would just be scratching their ears and looking at their bus timetables, and this is a man's life hanging in the balance. They are supposedly professionals.
Yeah.
They've chosen to not do the job that I guess they've trained their whole life to do, and they're ignoring someone and putting someone in prison on very blatant made-up charges and changing their minds. That feels much more evil than perhaps the lady doctor.
And I think that then brings home what it must be like to live in a society where the justice system is corrupt and the rule of law doesn't really apply and your rights don't really exist. And, that's a really alien thing for us.
That's the scariest bit of the whole thing, I think. It does terrify you. There's no way out, and then you do become trapped.
It's a sort of slight level of almost like my ability to process what I thought this might be like. Sorry to bring it down to a really banal pop culture level, but I just think about the Shawshank Redemption. And there's a moment where the library guy comes around with the cart at the beginning and he gets a book. And there's a sort of similar moment here for Altan where he gets a copy of Anna Karenina. Is it? Isn't it Tolstoy?
Sure, Tolstoy. Not sure which book it was. I don't think it was It wasn't a famous book. No, it was
maybe
like a
one
minor
of the
novel.
other. But still, Tolstoy.
Tolstoy.
Like, of all the writers to get, he got Tolstoy. Like, I remember feeling like, oh, thank God, he's got a good book. That's great.
It was a bad book by a good writer, I think he said.
One of the quite nice things in this is that he often throws in a quotation, but he didn't have the books to refer to there, so they're coming from his memory. And in the note at the beginning, the translator makes a point of just saying, I didn't verify those, I didn't correct them, I just left them as they were, as he remembered them. And that contributed to my sense of this amazing intellectual life that, had all these words just sort of stored away in his memory, waiting to be used.
I was very intrigued by his decision not to leave Turkey. Because it is very conscious, it is very deliberate, and he and his brother are obviously very prepared to be taken into prison, just like their father was,
and there's
decades before.
There's even a night, isn't there, where he is released. So he goes through one sort of crazy trial process, and then he is released from prison. Brother stays in there, but he is allowed to go free. He leaves the prison, walks out feeling free and also feeling sad because his brother's still in there, and then says, but I only had one night to feel this because the next day they came for me, and he was arrested on a different set of charges, and this time he is sent away. But again, even more the second time, I was like, just go now, flee, go abroad, go anywhere.
But he doesn't want to. I mean, he mentions in passing friends who are writing in exile, and obviously is not judgmental about that decision at all. But there's no question that he would ever leave Turkey. This is his country. This is his fight on behalf of his country. So that in itself is moving, even though he never ever remarks about it.
One of the things that gives it a certain extra dimension is this kind of keen knowledge you have of his current situation. And one of the things we were wondering is if he had been released and the situation was different, would it be quite as powerful? Would it be as affecting?
I don't think so. I think the writing would still be beautiful and everything else is still there, but it wouldn't be so emotional. I think he says in the book that the being in prison suddenly it gives extra weight to your words. So I think being released would make it different. I thought some of the book was perhaps a bit bitty, perhaps it didn't always hang together. If he'd spent more time polishing it, it could have been a much better book. But if he'd been released in the meantime, how would we have judged it? It might have been forgotten. So I think it has to be read very quickly, sort of urgently, while it's still relevant. I think I'm not sure how relevant it will be. I don't think it was perhaps a book which will last so long. There have been many other prison books and people going through perhaps similar things, but I think it's the urgency is probably required to appreciate it more.
It's almost impossible to criticise it in some ways, given everything.
Yeah, I think we all went through the score and decided the book, and I think we were quite surprised. I recommended it, and we all talked about what a lovely book it was, but some of us were quite harsh with the scoring because perhaps...
Seriously, that surprises me.
Well,
me.
It got a couple of...
Andy,
It's my book.
you scored your own book badly.
I do love it, and I love his voice, but it felt it was perhaps a few bits in there I didn't like so much, and it just felt a bit bitty.
What didn't you like?
I didn't like the story of the other prisoner who he borrowed his dream. There are a couple of bits in there I didn't really like his long talk about Tolstoy. I liked lots of the observations, but they didn't really seem to hang together as a book.
But then it was smuggled out, written on scraps
He
of
would
paper.
never have read it as a book,
No,
right?
exactly.
He would have written an essay at a time. So they are somewhat chronological, aren't they? They kind of track his experiences and
But
thoughts.
Yes, it
You
does.
assume they're
It
written
does,
chronologically.
but if he had been free to write it and have more time and perhaps be more involved in the editing, I'm sure it would be a very different book. So it is what it is, and it reflects how it was written. So I think that's why I felt it could have been better. I really loved his voice, but I didn't feel it was polished. I didn't feel it would last a long time. I think it's very, very current. But I think because it was rushed in the way it was brought out, I think that would have perhaps hindered it. And that's why I think I scored it less. I would love him as a writer. I would definitely read more by him. I just didn't feel all the sort of the essays quite hung together. And that's because we talked about the sympathy he gets because it's in prison and how perhaps that was blinding us. So maybe we tried very hard to overcome that prison and were harsher on the scoring.
What did you give it then?
I gave it 3, I think,
Out of 5.
out of
Yeah,
5.
So not so harsh. I think it's almost like that is partly as well why I think we were interested to read something else by him, because you can sense here is just an amazing writer. And it's true, I'm sure he would be the first to say this isn't my best book.
Yeah, I'm sure, exactly. I'm sure if you said I gave it a 5, are you mad?
Yeah.
Have you never read Tolstoy?
I don't know. I mean, generally, I think we all responded to this sort of wisdom and insight and the humanity of it. And obviously, it's quite specific to his own situation. But I think there's enough in it that transcends that and speaks to any human being who is placed in a situation where they're trapped, they're not free. And that sense of almost, if you're not in that situation, which we're fortunate to live in a country where we're not under that kind of threat, and it's unlikely that any of us will ever be thrown into prison for grumbling about Theresa May or whatever, it makes you really appreciate that. You have a keen sense of that freedom and what that freedom means and how we really ought to value it more instead of just taking it for granted and not thinking about it, because there are countries, and there are countries close to us, there are countries where we would just go on holiday without even thinking about it. There are countries where this kind of thing is going on, and that was incredibly important to read and understand.
It's even a challenge to your everyday life, in a sense, really, because he is in prison and he is choosing, through the power of his imagination, to reinvent his experiences and how he looks at the world around him. For us to get bogged down in day-to-day mundane things or to dwell on work issues or whatever, he'd be like, oh, cheer up, just think about it afresh and it all can be made well.
I worry that we're slightly painting this picture of him as this sort of chirpy chappy who's like,
There are some very dark passages.
Some kind of phrase like, it never rains but it pours, but
Yeah, fair enough, because there are some very dark passages, and although for all of these moments where he is able to rise above the horrific circumstances he's in, equally he goes down deep into the depths of despair and almost madness and has to create coping strategies.
Yeah.
At one point he walks incessantly, I think it's for 7 days, around his cell, only collapsing to fall asleep. And the reason he is walking all the time is that he has paced out how many steps it takes to get across the room and how much time that would add up to, and he leaves little pieces of paper to count the number of seconds. And in this way he's basically become his own clock, and that allows him to keep a grip on reality. Otherwise, he's worried he's just going to go absolutely insane.
Yeah. So, was it a good book club book?
I think it was very good. Everyone liked it. Everyone talked about it. I guess talking about democracy, talking about the politics, talking about, I guess, even Europe, sort of justice. I think there's lots to talk about. I think everyone warmed him as a person. And there were definitely flaws, but it led us on to discussing War and Peace, and Kate suggesting we read War and Peace.
I would just like to go on record as saying that I was not the person who suggested that we read War and Peace. I happily endorsed it because I think War and Peace is a great book and everyone should read it, and it's a page-turner, so why not? But it wasn't my idea.
It wasn't my idea.
Whose idea was it?
Do you get the slight sense that my book club now, so what we agreed we would do was we would read shorter things and we would have War and Peace ticking over in the background, and we had our first book club, under this sort of new system the other day, and there was some rumblings of discontent and a few people who hadn't managed to even read 50 pages of War and Peace.
I'm quite looking forward to it.
Yes,
on the record.
Because you're going to have to read it too.
Yes, I think so. Anyway, distraction. So, Ahmet Altan, I Will Never See the World Again. A beautiful book, if not perfect, and a great book club book.
I was just really happy that you brought it to my attention. I feel like otherwise I wouldn't have come across this book, even with my deep love of Philippe Sands. I'm not sure it would have been on my radar. It's true, as a book club book, it's not one of those ones where you're going to have a great time ripping it apart. You can't. It's sort of too precious, and you couldn't perhaps apply your normal book club, what's the word?
Forensic scalpel?
Yeah, maybe, yeah. But nonetheless, I think there is a really interesting discussion to be had around this, which is what made it a good book club book. It was great. As with many an Andy suggestion, it was a great read.
Could you do us a favour and read the last paragraph or two, last sentence or two, which someone read at the book club? I asked them to read it.
I am writing this in a prison cell, but I am not in prison. I am a writer. I am neither where I am nor where I am not. You can imprison me, but you cannot keep me here. Because, like all writers, I have magic. I can pass through your walls with ease.
The first time I read it, it really brought a sort of lump to my throat.
I think it's an incredible book club book. I would recommend it above and beyond almost anything we've read so far this year, because I think you're not going to find it otherwise. And actually, it's relatively slight, but packs a huge emotional punch and has lots of ideas and makes for a great discussion. So yeah, I was a huge, huge fan. Inspired by I Will Never See the World Again, here are some recommendations for your next book club read. Andy, what do you have for us?
Mine would be, talking of Turkey, Orhan Pamuk, perhaps the most famous author from Turkey, A Strangeness in My Mind. I like this book, or love this book, because it talks about Istanbul across the ages, and it does touch on all the changes and the coup and the anti-coup and the coup and the anti-coup. It talks about all the changes as the struggle for the country to grow and the different factions. So I think that plays into where Turkey is today, but also it gives a beautiful story about, I guess, an amazing city I'd like to see one day.
It sounds good. I'm a bit wary of Orhan Pamuk. I read The Museum of Innocence by him, and I had a real hate-love relationship with that book, in that mostly I hated it, but then I could kind of see there were things about it I loved. So I can't recommend that for a book club book because it's so long, and also I found it so annoying.
This is a very long book as well, but it's a very simple, very nice story, but it's a very, very long book. If you wanted something to discuss, I would recommend A Day in the Life of Yvan Denisovich by Solyenitzhn.
I think that's how
by
you say it.
Solyenitzhn, I don't know. Which is a very slim book again. It's just one day in the life of somebody in the Gulag, but the humanity you get from that book and how terrible it was to live there, and life being boiled down to such a very simple things in survival in one day, and how you survive that one day at a time. And that was an amazing book.
It feels like, again, it's in that category of things that you wouldn't necessarily read unless you read it for book club as well. Sometimes I think book clubs are quite good for that. I'm never going to read that left to my own devices, let's be honest.
You've not read it?
No.
I assume you all have read it.
It's not even on my bedside table.
I assumed everyone would have read it. You're all so knowledgeable. You read so much.
Nope, never heard of it.
Right.
Never read it.
Well, definitely, if I find it, I'll lend it to you.
But it's good.
And it's slim, you'll read it. It's an amazing book.
Okay. How about you, Laura?
I am going to recommend something very different, an essay by Albert Camus, who most people know as the author of L'étranger, The Stranger, but I am recommending his essay The Myth of Sisyphus, which is an existentialist musing, perhaps? I read it a long time ago for a literary theory course, I think probably in university, maybe I was about 20, but it's always stuck with me, and I think had more resonance than any other philosophical tract I read at the time. And it's basically Albert Camus, who was one of the great thinkers of existentialism, recounting the story of Sisyphus, who is a Greek not a Greek god, a Greek demigod.
Uh-oh. What's the...
Uh-oh.
Sisyphus? What happened to him?
Oh, I see. And he was sentenced by the gods to push a huge boulder up to the top of a mountain where it would roll down the other side, and he would have to go and continue this. And Albert Camus tells this myth, but in it he imagines how he has turned this act in which he has no choice, he has no say, he has been sentenced to this, he has no other option, but he has turned it into an act of defiance, basically, because he chooses to see it as a choice, which sounds mad. And I mean, obviously Camus is very articulate in making this case, but you do see how it could be possible to find meaning in the very mundane or the meaningless, and I think that really resonates with I Will Never See the World Again.
That does sound relevant. Again, wouldn't read that unless I was doing it for book club.
I think it's only about 20-30 pages. You
Sounds
might.
relevant to reading War and Peace.
Okay, well, I have a novel. It's not really super, super relevant, but it is picking up on the Turkey connection. This is Birds Without Wings by Louis de Bernières. Everybody knows Louis de Bernières from Captain Corelli's Mandolin. I liked Captain Corelli's Mandolin quite a lot, but I didn't think it was so great. But I like Louis de Bernières' writing, and so when this came out I did buy it and read it, and actually I think this is so much better than Captain Corelli. It's almost like all of the things that were sort of flawed in Captain Corelli he's sort of sorted out in this, and it's really wonderful. I'll just read the back. Set against the backdrop of the collapsing Ottoman Empire, the Gallipoli campaign, and the subsequent bitter struggle between Greeks and Turks, Birds Without Wings traces the fortunes of one small community in southwest Anatolia, a town in which Christian and Muslim lives and traditions have coexisted peacefully for centuries. When war is declared and the outside world intrudes, the twin scourges of religion and nationalism lead to forced marches and massacres, and the peaceful fabric of life is destroyed. Birds Without Wings is a novel about the personal and political costs of war, about love, between men and women, between friends, between those who are driven to be enemies, and between Philothea, a Christian girl of legendary beauty, and Ibrahim the goatherd, who has courted her since infancy. It's funny, I always feel like not that many people know this or have read this.
I've read it, I loved it.
It's great, isn't it?
It's not quite as perhaps cheesy or as simple as it sounds on the back. I think this whole goat herd and
well, that's almost like the thing about Louis de Bernières is, you know, always the kind of slightly quirky couple with the love relationship, and it's almost like what I loved about this was that wasn't really the focus of this novel, and instead it is this community and just these different people who are displaced, uprooted, and how they have to kind of make their lives, and it's much bigger in scope, and I really liked that. I thought he did that really well.
Yeah, much better than the blurb on the back gets across, I think.
Yeah. Sally in our book club, I've also had this chat with her because it's the same. It's like she's like, yeah, you know, it's so good. Why don't more people know about it?
I would quite like to borrow it off you. So you've already converted one person.
There you go. And the only bad news is, I'm afraid, it's 621 pages.
It's an easy read, though.
It is a page turner.
As a side note, speaking of page counts, I got taken to task by my friend Phil and book club member for describing Golden Hill as a long read. He's like, I think you're giving people the wrong impression. I'm like, but Phil, you know, that book is about 400 pages. He's like, yeah, that's not long.
It's true. I think he's right.
Oh, well, I'm not sure. I'm like, Phil, I think most people would define that as a long book.
I think it's 600 plus as long.
Okay, well, you and Phil are in the same camp, but yeah. I argued to Phil and I argued to you that you probably are in the small minority.
I love long reads, and it's a source of great frustration to me that I'm actually so busy in my reading life these days that I rarely get to really immerse myself in something long.
I love long reads, but only if I've chosen them. I think that's the risk with book club, is you end up choosing a very long book, or someone else has chosen a very long book, and then you're stuck with it.
Yes, we're very brave to recommend a long book.
Well, I'm looking forward to discussing Palace Walk, which is coming up for your book club, which is 600 pages, and I realised when I started to read it, the first in a trilogy.
Yes, indeed, and Phil would point out ahead of time, that is not a long book either.
That's all for this episode. Our book recommendations were A Strangeness in My Mind by Orhan Pamuk, A Day in the Life of Yvan Denisovich by Alexander Solyenitzhn, The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, and Birds Without Wings by Louis de Bernières. On our next book club show, we'll be discussing My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. It's the best-selling story of a Nigerian woman whose sister just happens to be, you guessed it, a serial killer. It was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2019, and it won the LA Times Award for Best Crime Thriller. But did it make for a good book club discussion? Listen in to find out.
But first, keep an eye out for our interview with Francesca of the Margate Bookshop. She told us all about her journey to realising the ultimate dream, opening up her very own independent bookshop in Margate.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes and never miss an episode?
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.